And welcome to episode 53. One moment, my audio not good. All right, that should work now. So, hello and welcome to episode 53 of Intercultural Insiders. My name is John McGraw, and I help newcomers, expats, and businesses connect across cultures to succeed in less time and pain. I am the founder of Hyaku Coaching, which is dedicated to helping you create your pathway to success in a new culture. The purpose of Intercultural Insiders is to share the stories of people with intercultural experiences. So if you're feeling isolated or lost, you can hear something from the guests' experiences that could help you, even if it's just a reminder that you're not alone. And today is part one of a two-part conversation with Luki Danukarjanto, who is going to be the last guest of 2023 for Intercultural Insiders, because after part two next week, we'll be going on hiatus for the holiday season. So I'm very excited to share what he has to say about finding a career that is personally fulfilling for you, whether you are a newcomer to Canada or someone who was born and raised here or an international student. But I thought I would start off not with an announcement as I usually do, but a bit of a reflection. Because the other day I attended the Culture of Cohesion event held by the Intercultural Skills Lab at Rotman School of Business in the University of Toronto. And that was an amazing event. In fact, in that situation, I was not just a person who was in attendance. I was, in fact, volunteering and working there, basically taking notes for some of the discussions that happened after the panel discussions, table discussions. So taking notes with the idea of sharing these notes later to eventually develop a community of practice, building towards not just having discussions about DEI and building bridges and making interculturally competent teams, but being able to develop actual practices and make practical changes. So I was eager, of course, and to be there early. I wanted to be there for the whole day. So I got up quite a bit earlier than usual. I'm actually a pretty early riser to begin with. I normally get up around 5 a.m. To start my day. And yesterday I got up at 4 a.m. because I wanted to make sure that I had enough time to do my workout, have a full breakfast, get cleaned up, get ready, get all of the things that I needed ready to get to the event on time for an early start. And I was quite proud of myself. I got there on time. I got into the Rotman School of Business. As you can imagine, in a major university like Toronto, it was quite busy, even early in the morning. And there was a display showing all of the different events that were going on. And I was surprised at the number that were going on starting from 8 a.m. And they were slowly appearing on the screen. And I got there and I waited until I saw the event that I knew the Culture of Cohesion was starting at 9 a.m. So as soon as I saw a listing for 9 a.m., I saw that and I went out to the building there, to the room rather, and there was no one there yet, but that didn't surprise me, of course, because I was there a bit early. It was about 8:30. So I thought, well, all right, I'll just take some time to relax and kind of settle in the area. And I was so proud of myself for being there early on that I even did a post that some of you may have seen on LinkedIn, a post about, the early bird gets the worm, and using it as an opportunity to discuss the ideas of time and the difference, seeing time as scarce or time as a plentiful resource, and spending more time on relationships. So I was quite proud of myself for putting this post, got a bit of reactions and comments, complimenting me on arriving early and saying it was good to arrive early. And I felt pretty good about myself. And then time went on, and then it was still around 9 o'clock, and there were some staff kind of setting things up in the rooms, but it didn't seem like anybody was who I knew was there or anybody. And I thought, okay, there would be at least some other note takers or some other people doing registration. So I finally got up and I decided after a while, okay, I'm going to go take a look at the sign again. There was one that was close by, and I saw 9 o'clock. The first one that popped up at 9 o'clock, the room that I was waiting outside of was a different event, and in fact, the event Culture of Cohesion was in a different room on a different floor. And this was after 9 o'clock that I realized that. So I rushed up there, and fortunately, I wasn't late because it was still during the registration and networking time, so I didn't miss the actual start of the presentations or discussions. But yeah, I didn't feel so proud of myself for arriving early, but it did make me think about again, perhaps me seeing time as a scarce resource and wanting to be early. I didn't take the time to wait and really fully process the times of the events that were being listed on that electronic schedule as they were popping up. So if I had taken maybe a bit more of a relaxed attitude, I would have seen and waited to see the actual full information rather than rushing off to get there. So I think that was a bit of a learning experience for me, as was, in fact, the Culture of Cohesion event as a whole, because there were so many topics, not always easy to discuss as well, particularly when the topics of indigenous rights and colonization and how that affects everything that we do, and perhaps even the idea that DEI wouldn't be necessary if colonization hadn't happened. And it's a very, I have to admit, uncomfortable topic, but definitely necessary. And I was able to meet in person a number of people that I'd known just from interacting over the internet. Of course, Sabina Michael, who is and Sean McCarty, who are the head organizers of the event. Jane Mendita had great conversations with, and Tessa DeSatanic from B. Riley Farber, who again, someone else who is also fascinated with culture and how it affects communication and how we can do more and better to make the corporate world and life better through greater understanding. So with all of that said, let's get into talking about the guest for today, part one, with Luki Danukarjanto. Luki is a career coach who moved to Canada when he was a child, and he helps everyone, but in particular, he really helps international students and young professionals develop a career with purpose. So he is particularly, because of his own experiences, I think, as well, he's especially helpful towards immigrants and the children of immigrants. And we talk about a number of things today, some of them including the power of networking, which is, again, as I've mentioned before, a theme that comes up frequently on this show. He emphasizes the importance of not just knowing people, but also being known by senior executives. Also bridging cultural gaps and talking, drawing, I think, on his own experiences as someone who immigrated to Canada early on in life and having some ties to his home culture, original culture that he came from, and of course, growing up in Canada and all of the experiences here, and bridging that, and also talking about some of the challenges that international students face when they're looking for work, and how one needs to be careful not to focus purely on academic pursuits, although those are, of course, important, but finding ways to turn that academic experience into a tangible experience that will translate into being able to talk more about connecting that experience to what employers are looking for. So he shares a lot. I don't need to talk so much about it because he shares far greater advice than I can, trying to summarize it here. And as you can see, Luki is in the chat. So please feel free to say hi to Luki. And it's great to have you here, Luki, as well. Really excited to share our conversation, part one. So As you know, Luki is in the chat here, so please feel free to comment, ask questions to him as the interview is going on, direct comments to me as well, and use this as an opportunity to be visible, which is something I think Luki would emphasize, and he does emphasize that importance and the shift in mindset of being visible. And that's one way to do it, commenting here. And I would encourage you to start off by just commenting, saying where you're joining us from, whether it's in Toronto, whether it's another part of the world. And then you can possibly connect with not just Luki or not just myself, but also other audience members. So, enough talk from me about that. Let's get into part one of the conversation with Luki Danukarjanto. Luki, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Thanks so much, John, for having me on the show. And so Luki Danukarjanto. I'd like to say that I'm a career coach who found his purpose, helping others find theirs. Born in Indonesia, and I immigrated to Canada when I was young with my parents and grew up in a largely immigrant household, trying to scrimp and save to make ends meet and do well, living the immigrant education promise where we had to go to university in order to become successful. And I ended up becoming a computer scientist. Like the stereotypical is you become like a doctor, lawyer, accountant, engineer. I couldn't quite get into engineering, so computer scientist was what I managed to get into. I graduated when the dot-com bubble burst, and it was really hard for folks in tech to get a job. I lucked out and landed a job in one of the consulting companies at Deloitte, and was a consultant there for 12 years. Used to also do a lot of things in talent management, campus recruiting, and things like that. And a couple of years ago, 2015, I left all that. So I would have been a senior manager. The next step would have been partner. That's the C-level executive in the consulting world. But I decided to do something a little bit different. And I guess now I'm an educator and entrepreneur, and I like to share my stuff I wish I knew earlier, which is what you didn't know you needed to know about jobs, careers, and life. So I have a goal to elevate education through soft skills learning, which is a very far cry from myself growing up as that stereotypical shy, introverted computer scientist kid in the corner trying to figure things out. And yeah, so that's my background.
As you said, being someone who is shy and introverted and now coaching regarding soft skills or power skills, basing it a little bit off of my own experience, something that maybe wasn't something that was instinctual to you because you were not that outgoing in the beginning, that it was something that you had to learn. And maybe as a result of that, that gives you more insight in being able to transfer it and teach it to others.
For sure. Growing up, I had a very, I'm going to call it an immigrant mentality where, again, keep your head down, work hard, do really well, and eventually you'll get noticed and be acknowledged for your work. So I actually found that when I was working at the consulting firm, I would do really well. I produced really great work. I had top performing scores in the performance management system. But unfortunately, like people were getting promoted sooner than me. I could see folks going through and say, what am I doing wrong? Because I do amazing work, sometimes even better work than him, her, or whoever, but they're getting recognized a little bit more. So I found that things like networking, which is one of those things that are often touted as the best way to land a job, is also prevalent in moving up the ladder and getting to higher parts of the corporate sphere. And in order for you to be up there, it's the expression, it's not what you know, it's who you know. And it really is not even about who you know, it's about who knows you, right? So if the senior executives up there know and recognize you, then you can get promoted. But if you're doing amazing work and nobody knows about you, it gets lost a little bit, which I understand is a little bit of some of the folks' frustration because, as you said, it's not necessarily instinctual. You're not supposed to brag. You're not supposed to talk about yourself. You're supposed to be humble and shy, that kind of like model minority, I guess is the typical phrase that people have. Yeah. And I like to help folks who are immigrants and newcomers like myself, or maybe a little bit fresher than myself, to change their limits and their boundaries to say, you know what? You're not in your home country anymore. You're now in Canada, and there's a different way of doing things, and you have the option. You could still be shy and introverted if you want, or there's this other path. And sometimes it becomes so-called like less natural, But I find that now for me, it's becoming more natural. Like I still have a tendency where I would rather be on my own, right? So probably after this podcast, I'll wipe the sweat off my forehead and say, I'm glad it's over. But at the same time, I do like to connect with people, have conversations. So that part of me, I think, was still there, but I didn't allow myself to kind of latch onto that. But yeah, so that's just a little bit of the context on that side.
I think a lot of it is really the mindset, that mentality that it's bragging or the idea that you're doing it specifically just to get something rather than it being more of a long-term approach. What ways did you find that you were able to make that shift?
Yeah, so that shift was a lot later in my life. And I think early on, there was a little bit of that identity crisis, right? Move from a new country right there. And when I was growing up, there was always the locals, the domestics, the people that were born here, right? There were the newcomers, which initially was us learning the language and getting into that. But because I came in so early, I was preschool before that happened. So when I started, it was pretty close to being like a domestic local. But then there was this new kind of category where I wasn't born here, but I'm not a newcomer anymore. So I'm somewhere in the middle. So it was, in some instances, a little bit difficult because you could connect with the newcomers because they still wanted to keep in touch with their previous culture. You couldn't connect with the Canadians because you weren't one of them. So we had to almost build our own new identity in the case where it's the hybrid version of it. Like how much of the East do you take? How much of the West do you take? And how much of it are you more Eastern focused, more Western focused, and going and back and forth. So it isn't necessarily easier. It's just different, right? Because obviously new to anywhere, there's going to be a little bit of that culture shock, right? Of, oh, that's not how I've done things in the past. But then going to figuring out like, who are you, right? Are you the person from the past culture, your nationality, where you came from? Or are you now assimilating into the new dynamic in the Western culture? So in my case, it was trying to bridge there where you'd have to figure out, do I hang out with the locals, the domestics, or do I hang out with the newcomers, right? And maybe sometimes trying to bridge it, sometimes successfully and unsuccessfully. And in terms of switching the paradigm, I don't know if that was necessarily something that was like an epiphany, that was like a transition. It was slow and steady. Maybe it was a version of the straw that broke the camel's back, that sort of thing, where just these little pressures to say, hey, I don't have to be like this. Part of it is also learning and growing, reading a lot of books that help me understand like different ways of changing your mindset and possibilities and stuff like that. And it's definitely one where, again, the Western attitudes are, there's possibility. Whereas the Eastern's a little bit more reserved, right? So it's going back and embracing that, hey, maybe I am more Western than Eastern, that sort of thing. So it's saying that, you know what, I can be like a Canadian, even though I'm not born here. And then it was just the gradual, I think it was the conscious effort to put in the amount of effort to develop the skills, right? Because if you don't know how to network, you won't know how to network until you network, right? You don't just suddenly read a book or watch a movie or whatever and take a course and now you can network. You have to go there, have some awkward conversations, probably make some mistakes, weird silences or maybe some faux pas, and then correct and get better and better and better. So it was a journey over time, and maybe it's more the understanding that failure was okay. And as I was thinking through things, it's not necessarily just like an Eastern or Western or immigrant or non-immigrant. It's oftentimes like how society grooms us, right? Networking. How can you network when you were taught at a young age that you don't talk to strangers, right? That's bad. And that's whether you're an immigrant or not, don't talk to strangers. But as you grow up, you realize you don't talk to strangers maybe in a dark alley in the wrong side of the neighborhood. But generally speaking, you can talk to strangers and strike out a conversation. So it's getting past the mix between the immigrant newcomer mindsets versus just, hey, keep your kids safe mindsets and stuff, and flipping that over to trying to develop the skills appropriately.
Great point that you bring up on all of those aspects. And I know, although you do help newcomers, as you mentioned, it's not necessarily your exclusive focus. Mm-hmm. You're looking to help anybody who's looking to make that next step. It was interesting, the idea of second generation immigrants. And you mentioned earlier that, okay, there's sometimes that expectation in your own background of being an engineer, getting into sciences and so on. I'm just curious about your own thoughts about career prospects for second generation immigrants, where maybe family pressures to be in a certain field that maybe they don't necessarily have that interest?
Yeah, in our circles, not necessarily growing up, but later on, I found there's an acronym, DEAL or no deal. And DEAL was an acronym for doctor, engineer, accountant, lawyer. So those were the safe, the reputable, the ones that most people aspire to, right? So if your parents could brag that you got into law school, med school, like engineering school, or in accounting, then they would be proud and happy parents. Other than that, it's maybe you're the black sheep of the family. So it's teasing out those possibilities, because in a generation, 2 generations ago, those were the very reputable career paths. But now there are so many that you can go into that many people have never heard of. So I went to computer science, and call it, 10, 20 years ago, that was a fledgling thing that people were trying to get into, but people could see the potential, right? And because it was a close cousin to engineering, then it seemed pretty appropriate. Now, pre-pandemic, there were so many folks that were looking to get into tech, right? Because the promise of high-paying wages out of Silicon Valley and things like that. Then there's so many other ones where people don't even think about things like supply chain, where in the past, supply chain meant that you are in a warehouse putting things in boxes and shipping it out. No, there's a whole supply chain where it's forecasting, modeling, like relationships and things like that, which are way broader than that. Really, it's taking the time out, again, not necessarily in the immigrant context, but in any student context, to open themselves up to the possibility of other career paths, right? But I find that the immigrant population is a little more fixated on those kind of 4. Maybe there's a couple of other ones that are also in there, but they're really focused on that because they're making more. Now, it seems to be that nowadays that some accountants, some lawyers, they may or may not be making as much as, let's say, a contractor doing renovations for a house, because there's a lot of need for trades and things like that. So sometimes plumbers can be making more than accountants, right? Someone at the Big Four in terms of like timing, hours worked and stuff like that, right? So there's a detangling of what is success for folks. Is it a title? Is it a career? Is it a domain? Is it how much money they make? Because oftentimes that's the other thing, because moving to a new country, you want to be financially secure and stable and things like that. So depending on how things shape up or how open the parental generation is, then there's so many more opportunities and possibilities, right? It's up to you to just go out and explore. So I highly encourage those that are second generation or close to, right? The ones that are looking to do something else, have those conversations with mom and dad to say, what do you really want from me? Do I have to become a lawyer, an accountant? And I sometimes pick on accountants because they often are the ones where, if you're a doctor, you're helping people. If you're a lawyer, you're doing pretty good. Engineer, you're building stuff. When you're an accountant, right, they often are the ones that are like, they were successful. They got to where they wanted to be, and they're miserable because of busy season, because of this and that. But they're only doing it because mom and dad wanted them to do it. So if that is your go-to proposition for your career path, you may want to think about it. Otherwise, you'll be seeing me later on to try to find that career path. So again, for those second generation or those close to, take a look at what's out there, because there's more than you think is probably possible.
Great point. With things changing so often and what's considered valuable, and just having that flexibility and being able to look at what really fits you, and the willingness to also change, of course, as well. What skills can you transfer, as opposed to being more specific on that this is the path I'm going to take?
Yeah, and I sometimes extend that to the immigrants here who end up landing a job maybe a couple of steps below what they used to have back home, and then they get comfortable there, but they don't want to get back to the same level or do something different because they're safe, they're comfortable, they're doing what they needed to do to get their parents there, versus having the kind of drive, passion, interest to say, do you actually wake up and want to go to work? Right? Now, if folks had a choice, I'm sure they would rather not go to work. I question that a little bit, because there's the quote, if you do what you love, you never have to work a day in your life, that sort of thing. So why can't you do that, right? Whether you are the kids of the parents or the parents that immigrated, why can't you do that? Because once you put on the hard work and your kids are in school, they're ready, hey, this is your time to explore and do interesting things as well.
Moving to a related area, thinking about international students, and when they're looking for work, how can they compete with domestic students in terms of work, in terms of balance and getting where they want to go?
Yeah, I find that there are different camps of international students, right? So some of them are the very academic, the studious, the 4.0s, A+ students that are very book smart, but unfortunately, if they complete their studies just focused on their academics, they often don't get as far as they would hope, right? Because of some of the things we alluded to, like networking and what have you. So oftentimes it's translating the academics into tangible experience, be it like a part-time job, a summer internship. Those are some things that are crucial, right? Some programs have internships, work integrated learning, those types of things. Some of them don't, right? So depending on where you came from and what school you landed here in Canada, then you might have been sold the vision that, yeah, just go to the school and it's so easy to get a job. Whereas the reality is oftentimes it's the work experience because, as you said, you're competing against the domestic talent plus the other ones who have 3 co-op terms, 5 co-op terms, that sort of thing, part-time jobs, internships, and things like that, versus you with your nice shiny 4.0 degree, right? And if you aren't even in that spectrum or that level, then it gets even more challenging. So I would put a couple of things. As one, I often find that some international students fall into the trap of, because a place like Toronto, Canada is super multicultural, right? You can almost find your culture and never leave it, but still be in the cities. You don't even have to speak English much of the time, right? So really take the time to get yourself familiar with the culture, folks that do speak the language, that are familiar with these different career prospects, so that your eyes are a little bit open to that, right? Versus kind of turtling in, finding what's comfortable, connecting with your own, right? Sometimes that seems more comfortable, but that will only be a short-term comfort, right? Expanding your horizons, trying new things, and not being dissuaded from taking those supposedly lesser work opportunities, because oftentimes the part-time job in the retail place is the stepping stone to get you like a job at one of the big four, a job at somewhere else, right? Because without those experiences, you would be just like everybody else in terms of competition. So thinking through things more broadly instead of just, oh, I have to work at McDonald's for the next little while. Well, there's nothing wrong with that. And not necessarily doing it if you have the means for as like a survival job or whatever, because there's many different survival jobs, and finding the ones that kind of align best to where you want, hop around and explore a little, I think would be something that I would encourage international students to do. Again, everyone's in their different situations. They're also the ones where they've been given kind of a gift from mom and dad. They're very well off, and they're just coming here because like a Canadian, a North American degree looks nice before they go back home, right? And take over their family business, right? So in those cases, you're here anyway. You might as well enjoy, understand how like different cultures work, how to relate to different types of people, different personalities and stuff like that. So make the most of it so that when you do take over the family business, then you're a little better off having that extra experience, right? And then there's all the folks in between, because there are some folks who, yeah, they got here just by the skin of their teeth. There are some international students where I know the village pooled together their money and resources to show the government that, yeah, we're funded, we can stay here. But meanwhile, their prospects are to pay the money back and eventually bring the entire village over through sponsorships and things like that. So they're working 1, 2, 3 jobs, plus going to school, plus trying to sponsor, plus all this other stuff. So there's people in dire straits. So it's really understanding kind of the purpose of why you are here, for your education, for helping others. And at the end of the day, also adding some self-care into the mix as well. Because oftentimes folks are here doing it from themselves, doing it for their parents and stuff, but they don't take the time to manage themselves. And whether it's simple things like exercising, eating well, and all that sort of stuff, the traditional kind of student diet also applies for international students as well, right? So there's all of those things compounding together. But if I were to summarize it for international students, again, be familiar with what your local culture requires or entails. Work experience is super important. And again, that's probably not just for international students. That's probably all students there. And, but more so because again, you're competing with the domestics that are local. They've been here all their life. So if I had a choice between someone that's lived here all their life and someone that I may or may not need to sponsor for a post-grad work permit or something like that, then I pick the easier option. So you need to be able to show a little bit more value as a result of that, right? And my hope is that a lot of the folks, because you have the ability to move like halfway across the world, the resiliency, the innovativeness, and the grit is there so that you can make sure that you're successful after your studies are done here.
Fantastic. Part one of the conversation with Luki. And I've realized, I think because I took so much time telling my story at the beginning, there's not much time for the wrap up here. So I'm just going to wrap things up by telling you that if that was only part one of that fantastic conversation with Luki. So you can take a look here for part two coming up next week, which is again the last episode of Intercultural Insiders for 2022 before we go on break for the holidays on Wednesday, November 22nd at 12 p.m. Eastern Time. Again, Luki is going to continue sharing his wisdom about international students, but also mentioning things such as the importance, again, continuing of stepping out of your comfort zone and how you need to spend so much, 80% of your time exploring new experiences and how to challenge yourself. And he'll get more into detail about that. And also the importance of volunteering and how it's not just about giving back, but there are so many other opportunities that come as a result of volunteering. And it's something not to ignore. So again, that is next week, Wednesday, November 22nd, 12 p.m. Eastern Time, the last episode of 2022. So be sure to tune in for that. Until then, keep navigating your way between cultures towards your goals.